Hello and welcome back to another FL Studio Basics video. So this is going to be a really basic video about drum programming in FL Studio. I'm going to be showing three ways of doing drum programming in FL Studio. The first is going to be using the channel rack to make patterns and then sort of arranging these in the playlist. The second is going to be actually dragging the samples onto the playlist and arranging them by eye and having control over it that way. And the third method is going to be using the FPC drum pad. This video really is aimed at beginners on the software, so if you've only been using it for a few weeks or you've been using it for longer but you've never tried actually using drums on the software, this is the sort of video for you. It's not going to be going into really advanced and complicated drum programming. Because this is for beginners, we're just going to be taking it from the very first step. So when you open up FL Studio, this is probably what it looks like. You have a mixer, which you can open up with F9. You have the channel rack, which you can open and close with F6. And you have the playlist, which you can open and close with F5. So the channel rack is the first place that we're going to be arranging our drums. And then we're going to be using that and making patterns. And then those patterns we're going to sequence on the playlist. And the whole time, all the audio is going to be running through the mixer. This is how the channel rack will open up initially. You will have a kick, clap, hat, and a snare sample. So this shows you what samples you have in your project, and we will be adding to these in just a moment. But if you click on any of them, it pulls open this wrapper window and it gives you more information about the sample and lets you demo it just by clicking there. And this is the same for all of the samples. You may have tried experimenting with these blocks here. You simply left click on a beat to add that sample, and if I press play, you may have figured this out, but there's a few handy tips that can really take you a lot further than just that sort of 1 to 4 bar loop. So the first thing would be actually having control over this channel rack. So if you go to these dots here, you can expand this sideways so that you can see what the samples are actually called in case they have any longer names. And you can also extend this out sideways so that you're not just stuck with a really small pattern. You can have longer patterns and more complicated patterns. And then when we have more samples, we can drag it up and down so that we can see all of them. If you want to change the tempo of your pattern, you just have to go up to the tempo here and you can change it just by dragging. So we're going to start by just sequencing a very simple sort of kick and clap pattern. So the first thing I'm going to do is just click on each of the beats that I want there to be a kick, and this is a 4 on the floor pattern. And then I'm also going to paint in the ones that I want with the clap, so I'm going to have it on every second. And then with the hat, we're going to try a different technique. So instead of painting them in and drawing them like this, and I'm using the left click to add them and the right click to take them away. So I'm going to right click on the hat and I'm going to click fill each 2 steps. And it just fills it in like that for me. So at this point, we've created a pattern and it's called pattern 1 by looking up here. And if I were to click on the playlist, it would add this pattern in. And now if I press play on the playlist, we have our first pattern. But I would like to be able to separate this out so that I have control over the individual patterns. So what we can do is in the pattern view up here, we can right click and select split by channel. And what this has done is separate them all out. So in this case, I have the kick, the claps, and the hat just like this. Which gives you an awful lot more control over arranging it in your project. So if you had a song, you could maybe just start just with the kicks and then add the claps in and then add the hats in after that, for instance. So the next thing would be adding our own samples in, because it's really unlikely that we actually want to use the samples they have. So let's look for samples, and the first place to do this would be by going to the browser here, and if it's not available, just drag out from the left hand side of the screen. We're going to go into packs, and you've got drums and drums from mode audio. So if you don't have your own sample packs yet, this is a great place to start. Let's say we're looking for a kick. I'm just going to click through here until I find one that I like. When I eventually find one that I like, all I'm going to do is click and drag then drag it onto the channel rack in a free space here. You could also right click on the sample and go open in new channel, and it will also add it in there. So now that we have a new sample, we can open it up just like before and audition it, but we can use this box here to send it somewhere on the mixer. So I'm just going to scroll up and down and send it to 5 on the mixer so that I can process that properly. Now I'm just going to look for a different hi-hat sound because I didn't like the one they had. Let's just use that first one. Again, I'm just dragging it in there and I'm going to send it somewhere on the mixer. You'll want to stay organized with all of this, so you'll want to be potentially, coloring these just by right-clicking, rename color, and give it a color. And then if you want, you can name and color the mixer as well. So if you click on the sample and then click on the mixer track that you want to send it to and press Ctrl and L at the same time, it will send it there and also color that channel for you, just so that you stay super organized. Now that we've already made a simple pattern and we've picked some samples that we like, we're going to create a new pattern by pressing F4 or by clicking up here. And I'm going to name my pattern drums, and I'm going to give it a color of red. Then I'm going to just paint in whichever ones I wanted, that 4 on the floor pattern, and fill each 2 steps. And then I'm going to press play by hitting up here. And I'm just going to add a snare in as well. And then if I'm happy with it, I can just add it in on the playlist, or I could use a different tool like the brush tool to paint it in the way I want. The last thing to mention about the channel rack here would probably be that if you want to change the velocities of any of these notes or make slightly more complicated rhythms that aren't just stuck to these beats, if you right click and select piano roll, and I'm just going to collapse these windows, this is showing us the hi-hats. I'm just going to play only the hi-hats. But if we want to change their velocity, you can see down here in the control, you can select velocity, and I could change their velocities like this. Make some really loud. And just experiment with them to get them a little bit of life. Or if you wanted to, you could zoom in and you could add more. Or you could move them off the grid by holding Alt and, making a little roll or something like that. So that would be the first method of drum programming inside FL Studio, and it's very simple. I would usually use that method for things that were very regimented and always the same, like a 4 on the floor kick drum pattern. The next thing would be actually dragging the drum samples straight onto the playlist. So in this case, I'm just going to find a kick. And instead of dragging it onto the channel rack, I'm just going to take that sample and drop it right onto the playlist. I have that kick on the playlist. And I'm just going to quickly rename this track kick. And then I'm going to go auto name clips so that they're always called kick, and I can just paint it across and get that 4 on the floor pattern that I want. If I pull up the channel rack by pressing F6, the kick will have been added to the audio section. And again, I can select it just like before and audition the sample here. And I can send it wherever I like on the playlist, just the same as when we were using MIDI. All of the samples you're using in your project will be stored here. So if you want to use any of them on the playlist, you can simply select it. For instance, this snare, and then you can drag from here straight onto the playlist as well. And this method of drum programming is what I use most of the time because it offers me quite a lot more freedom in some ways. The only way that it sort of lacks in the freedom is that if you're programming hi-hats, it's harder to change the velocity because you would have to go into each sample and change the velocity here instead of just easily changing it on the piano roll. I still tend to use the piano roll when it comes to doing complicated little things like those hi-hat rolls where I really need that sort of perfect timing. But for most of the stuff, I just arrange straight onto the playlist like this. Another reason that I do this is because it can be really easy to fool yourself by clicking on these boxes and assuming that your drums are in time. And this is a big problem with producing music on a computer, is that there's this thing called plug-in delay compensation or sample delay compensation, where if you start adding processing to your drums, the processing will take a different amount of time to get from the start to the finish. So some of your samples will actually be delayed in their start time, and the computer really tries very hard to keep up with this, but when projects get huge, it usually struggles, in my opinion. So just because something on the playlist shows that it starts at the right time, it might be worth selecting them and dragging them forward or back in time until it actually is perfectly in time. When it comes to drum timings, you have to really just close your eyes and only rely on your ears, because it doesn't matter if the grid says it's perfect, it's only going to be perfect when it actually sounds perfect and in time. And again, with this method, it's worth always staying clean and clear and organized in your project, and making sure that you're sending all the samples somewhere on the mixer so that you can control them independently. I have a really easy template which is free to download. I'll leave a link to the video where you can download that just in the description, and that has sort of a really clean and clear organization for all of your drums and instruments. Especially if you're new to FL Studio, it should really simplify the mixer and the playlist for you. So we've looked at the channel rack and creating MIDI patterns with drums, and we've looked at just arranging the drums straight onto the playlist. The next method would be to use the FPC. So if you click add here, and we're looking for drum machines, and we're going to add the FPC. So this is the new update for the FPC, which looks really nice. It's a lot nicer looking than the old one. And this is your drum machine inside FL Studio. So some people swear by using something like this for their workflow. Other people stay completely away from it. I don't tend to use it, but that's just because it doesn't fit into my workflow. And lots of people, it will fit perfectly for them. In here, you have drum pads, which are all loaded up with drums. In this case, we have a very real live sounding drum kit. You could load any samples into here, and if you want, you could control it using a MIDI drum pad or even just a MIDI keyboard. I like to use the MIDI to control these. So one way of doing it would be to play the drums and record, but the next method would be to create a pattern. In this case, I'm going to call it FPC drums. And then I'm going to go into the piano roll by pressing F7. And if I just close the mixer for a moment, you'll see that the piano roll has been replaced. Instead of having the piano, you can see all the samples here. So you could simply add in the samples just like we were earlier. And if I press play, so just like before, you can control the FPC with the MIDI, and if you click, it will just be added into a pattern there. But you might not like the samples they have. For instance, if we're producing electronic drums, this kick drum just isn't going to cut it. So if I take a different kick, maybe that kick for instance, I can simply drag and drop that straight onto the FPC, and this pattern, it sounds all crazy because the samples don't match up with each other, but I've replaced the kick drum right there. So if you click just into the presets, you can choose different types of kits. So I could have an electronic kit, and there we go. That's a lot more electronic sounding. So if I press play here, yeah, that's a lot more sort of a cohesive sound there. And a lot of people swear by using a drum kit machine like this, and there's so much detail that can be gone into about this. On each sample, snare for instance, you can change the tuning, you can change the panning, you can change the volume, and you can also multi-layer samples so that if you hit the sample at a different velocity, it might actually trigger a different sample. So for instance, if you were playing softly, it might just be a stick hit on the side of a snare, but if you hit hard, it will be the middle of the snare and you'll get the full body and the sound. You can't split the channels immediately with the FPC, but what you can do is just create more patterns, and you could make one unique by clicking here and pressing make unique, and then you can just delete the things that you don't want. So now I have an FPC sample at the top that has the kick and the snare, and the FPC on the bottom just has the hi-hat. And you could be layering these up just the same as before, but instead of worrying about all the samples being stored here, you only need to worry about your drum samples being held on this drum pad here. And even though I've pulled up a preset, still of course replace any of these samples and control all sorts of different parameters to do with the drum programming, but I said I wouldn't go into too much detail just in this video. I hope as a basic video this has introduced you to 3 different really easy ways to program drums inside FL Studio. There's plenty more FL Studio Basics videos on this channel, and I hope to do loads more in the future. So thank you very much for watching. Bye for now.